The wind swept dry dust across the plains, stinging Lydia Cross's cheeks as she stood by the fence line of her ranch. The land was wide, rolling, and stubborn as the woman who tried to keep it alive. For months the rain had failed her and the cattle looked thin, ribs showing against the fading light. Still, she kept her back straight, her hands steady, and her eyes sharp. Pride was the only thing she had left in plenty. Her ranch was more than soil and fences. It was her late husband's sweat, her father's dream, and the only proof to the town that a woman could work the land as hard as any man. But the whispers were spreading. Some said she was too proud to ask for help. Others claimed she was bound to lose everything before winter set in. Lydia knew every glance at her in town carried a weight. Sympathy from some, scorn from others, and quiet expectation from those who wanted to see her fail. She wasn't entirely alone. Boone Calder had made his presence clear, too clear. Boone was a cattleman with deep pockets, a man whose boots never seemed to carry dust no matter how far he rode. He owned more land than anyone in the county, and people said he wanted the rest too. Lydia had no patience for him. She had seen the way men like him carved up land, swallowing smaller ranchers whole, until no one could stand against them. But Boone didn't come with threats. He came with an offer. That was worse. She remembered the way he leaned against her porch post that afternoon, his shadow long against the boards. "You can't hold this place alone," he said, his voice even, not cruel but heavy with certainty. "The drought will finish what time already started. You want your ranch or you want your pride? Because you won't keep both?" Lydia had stared at him, fire in her eyes. "This land is mine, not yours, not anyone's." Boone's reply cut sharper than any knife. "I don't want your land alone. I want you, your ranch, your body, and your Sundays." The words rang in her ears long after he left. He had said them like a vow, not a jest, as though marriage to him was no bargain but a binding contract. Lydia's hands had shaken once the door closed, though she didn't let him see. Anger flared, but so did something else, confusion maybe, or a dangerous kind of curiosity. Why would a man with wealth, land, and reputation tie himself to a widow clinging to dying cattle? The town stirred quickly with the story. Lydia heard the laughter behind her when she bought feed. She saw the raised brows when she walked past the church steps. By sundown, a preacher had visited her porch to warn her of selling herself into shame. It was Boone's doing, they said. He wanted her reputation to crumble so she would have no choice but to lean on him. But Lydia knew there was another shadow in play. Silas Hart, the rival land baron, had long desired her stretch of river-fed pasture. He had tried to buy her out after her husband's death, and when she refused, his interest turned cold then cruel. He stood to gain most if her ranch fell, and Boone Calder's sudden proposal complicated the game. That night, Lydia sat by the lantern flame staring at her ledger. Numbers told the truth. Her cattle were starving, her savings were near gone, and her land was one season away from ruin. Boone's words still echoed sharp and steady. Her ranch, her body, her Sundays. For the first time, Lydia Cross felt a choice pressing in like a storm. Stand alone and lose everything, or bind herself to a man she did not trust and risk losing far more. The next morning, Lydia saddled her mare before dawn. The air was cool, carrying the smell of dust and dry grass. She rode the fence line, counting the cattle, watching them stagger weakly toward the shallow creek. The sound of their hollow cries tore at her heart. She could mend a fence, she could break a horse, but she could not command the skies to open. At the far end of her land, she found something that made her jaw tighten. Fresh tracks, wagon wheels pressing deep into the soil. Strangers had crossed her property in the night. She followed them, heart beating faster until she saw broken posts where the creek ran narrow. Someone had torn down part of her fence. Her cattle were drifting into the open range. She mended what she could, pulling the wood back into place, her hands raw and splintered. But the damage was clear. Someone wanted her borders weak. She thought of Silas Hart, the rival land baron, and her suspicion burned hot. He had always coveted this creek. Without it, her ranch would dry and crack like old bone. By the time she rode into town for supplies, the sun was high, and the dust seemed thicker than ever. The chatter hit her before she even reached the general store. Women in bonnets whispered from the porch. Two ranch hands nudged each other and smirked as she passed. The words stung, though no one spoke them to her face. Boone Calder's bargain. Inside the store, she kept her chin high. She bought flour, salt, and one small sack of cornmeal, barely enough to stretch the week. As she placed her coins on the counter, the storekeeper leaned close and lowered his voice. "Lydia, I'd be careful. Boone's name on your lips is one thing. His boots at your doorstep are another. Folks are saying you've already given him Sundays." Her cheeks flushed, but her eyes stayed hard. Folks say a lot when they're bored. She grabbed her goods and left before the tears threatened. Outside, she nearly collided with Boone himself. He stood tall, hat tilted back, eyes steady on her. "You've been busy," he said, nodding toward the supplies. "I don't need your help," she snapped. "Didn't offer any," Boone replied smoothly, though his gaze softened. "But you do need allies, Lydia, and the town's turning fast. Silas is fanning the flames. He wants you cornered." Lydia's chest tightened. She hated that Boone spoke the truth. Silas' heart's reach was long, longer than her savings, longer than her patience. She swung into her saddle and turned to leave, but Boone's voice followed. "Think on what I said. Pride won't keep the cattle fed." Back at the ranch, she found more evidence of trouble. An empty water barrel tipped on its side, the rope cut clean. Someone had been there while she was gone. Her fist clenched, rage mixing with fear. This was no accident. It was pressure, plain and sharp. Silas's way of softening her up before he struck. That night, as the lantern flickered low, she laid her hand flat on the ledger again. She had less than a month before ruin. She whispered to herself, steady and stubborn, "I will not sell. I will not beg. And I will not belong to Boone Calder." But even as she said it, the sound of hooves echoed faintly in the distance. Someone was watching the ranch. Someone is waiting for her to break. The next day began with smoke. Lydia woke to the faint scent of burning and hurried outside, heart pounding. In the distance, a pile of brush smoldered near the fence line. The fire hadn't spread far, but someone had set it. She stamped it out with her boots, coughing through the ash, her hands black with soot. This wasn't just broken fences anymore. It was a warning. Whoever set that fire wanted her afraid. By mid-morning, she rode into town to speak with Sheriff Wallace. The sheriff was a fair man, though slow to act unless he had proof. When Lydia told him about the fire, the cut ropes, and the torn fence, he rubbed his chin, frowning deeply. "Hard to lay blame without seeing a hand do it," he said. "But you're right to worry. Silas Hart's been sniffing around deeds and papers in my office. If he's scheming, he'll want you worn down first." Lydia's stomach twisted. Proof or not, Silas was pressing her from every side. And now Boone Calder's strange offer sat heavy in the middle of it all. As she walked out of the sheriff's office, she caught sight of Boone across the street. He was speaking to two townsfolk, shaking hands, looking every bit the respected cattleman. When his eyes met hers, he tipped his hat. Lydia turned away, heat rising in her chest. She hated how calm he always looked, as if nothing could move him. By afternoon, the preacher arrived at her ranch. Reverend Merrick was stern, his black coat dusty from travel. He stood on her porch, hands folded, eyes sharp. "Lydia," he said, "I must speak plain. This town will not stand for scandal. They say you've struck a bargain with Boone Calder, a bargain that trades more than land. If you let this talk grow, your name will be ruined." Lydia's jaw tightened. "And if I let Silas Hart drive me off this land, what will I be then?" "Ruined anyway." The preacher's eyes softened, but his voice stayed firm. "There is ruin of reputation, and there is ruin of the soul. Choose carefully." He left her with those words, his shadow long across the yard. That evening, Lydia found a bundle left at her gate. Inside lay a small sack of grain, a jug of water, and a note in Boone's hand. "You don't have to fight alone." Her throat tightened. She wanted to throw the bundle away, to spit at his pity, yet she carried it inside. Pride burned, but so did weariness. As the sun set, the ranch fell quiet except for the restless lowing of cattle. Lydia sat at her table, staring at Boone's note. She thought of her late husband, of the promise they had once made to build a life here together. She had buried him on the ridge under the cottonwood tree, swearing to keep the land alive. Now 2 men pulled at her fate. Boone with his bold, unsettling bargain, and Silas with his ruthless hunger for her land. The townsfolk watched, whispering, ready to believe the worst. Even the preacher had warned that her soul was at risk. She clenched the note in her fist until her knuckles turned white. The ranch was hers. Her body was hers. Her Sundays were hers. But for how much longer? Outside, the night was too still. A coyote cried far off, and in that silence Lydia knew the fight had only just begun. The days grew harsher. The creek dropped to a thin trickle, the earth cracking in wide veins across the pasture. Lydia walked the fields at dawn and dusk, her boots heavy with dust, her throat dry from the heat. Each morning more cattle lay weak, unable to rise. She knelt beside them, stroking rough hides, whispering soft prayers, but prayer didn't bring water. Word in town spread faster than the drought itself. Each trip for supplies brought sharper stares. Some pitied her. Others mocked her. She overheard 2 men outside the blacksmith's shop. She'll fold soon. Silas will see to it, or Boone'll take her pride in exchange for the land. The words struck hard, but Lydia walked on, shoulders squared, refusing to let them see the crack in her armor. One evening, as she hauled buckets from the well, she saw a figure approaching on horseback. Boone called her, calm as ever, dismounted at her gate. She wanted to ignore him, but his voice carried across the yard. "You've lost more cattle," he said simply, his gaze fixed on the herd. "They're mine to lose," Lydia shot back. He stepped closer, dust crunching under his boots. "Pride is a fine thing, but pride doesn't fill a trough. Let me bring water. Wagons of it. I can keep your herd alive through this dry spell." Lydia's jaw tightened. "At what cost, Boone?" "You'll bring water and the town will say I paid in shame. You'll look like the savior and I'll look like your kept woman." Boone's expression didn't change, but his voice lowered. "Let them talk. They've always talked. What matters is keeping this land in your hands." She turned from him, the weight of his words pressing on her chest. Anger, pride, and exhaustion swirled together. She wanted to scream, but instead she said, steady as she could, "If you want to help, stop circling me like a vulture. Stop asking for more than my land can give." For a long moment Boone didn't answer. Then he set his hat back on his head and returned to his horse. "Think on it," he said before riding into the fading light. That night Lydia couldn't sleep. She sat at her window, listening to the cattle shift restlessly, watching the horizon where Boone had disappeared. His words clung to her mind, as stubborn as the dust that clung to her clothes. The next morning brought a sharper blow. She found hoofprints leading to her barn, and inside a feed sack was slashed open, grain spilling across the dirt floor. Her heart sank. It wasn't random mischief. It was sabotage, deliberate and cruel. She thought of Silas Hart again, and the way his men always rode past her land with slow, mocking stares. By noon word reached her that Silas was boasting in town, saying her ranch would soon change hands, that she was nothing but a widow clinging to ashes. The talk spread quickly, twisting Boone's bargain into a scandal. Some said she had already given herself to him. Others said she would lose everything because she was too stubborn to bow. Lydia stood alone on her porch that evening, fists clenched, staring at the horizon. The sky was wide, endless, and merciless. She whispered into the dry wind, not knowing if it was a prayer or a curse. "If Boone Calder wants my ranch, he'll have to bleed for it. And if Silas Hart wants my land, he'll have to burn with it." The choice pressed closer, sharp as a blade. Time was running out. The next week tested every ounce of Lydia's strength. The sun rose cruel and unrelenting, drying the last patches of green until the land looked like brittle parchment. She hauled water by hand, rationed grain to the weakest cattle, and worked until her arms trembled. Each night she collapsed into bed with her boots still on, her body aching, her spirit stretched thin. But the ranch wasn't the only thing breaking. In town, whispers grew louder, sharper. The general store clerk stopped greeting her kindly. The women at the church turned their heads when she walked past. Children pointed and giggled, repeating the words they'd heard their parents say. One afternoon, while buying salt, she overheard a cruel laugh from behind the shelves. "Boone Calder's already got her wrapped tight. She'll wear his brand before long." Lydia spun on them, eyes blazing. "Say that to my face," she snapped. The men quieted, shifting uncomfortably, but none denied it. Their silence was worse than the words. When she stepped outside, Boone was waiting with his horse tied nearby. He didn't smile. He just studied her face, reading the exhaustion written in every line. "Let me ride with you," he said softly. She stiffened. "I don't need an escort. Not an escort. An ally." His words lingered as she rode home, her jaw tight. She wanted to refuse him, to throw his offer back in his face. But part of her, some small unwelcome part, longed for someone to stand beside her, even if it was Boone Calder. That evening, she found 2 wagons parked near her barn. She reached for her rifle, but when she drew close, she saw barrels stacked high with water and sacks of grain tied shut. Boone's men were unloading them under the fading light. Her anger flared hot. She stormed toward them, voice sharp. "Who told you to bring this here?" Boone stepped out from the shadows, calm as ever. "No one told me. I chose." "You'll have this town saying I've sold myself to you," she spat. "Do you know what you've done?" Boone met her fury with steady eyes. "I know what I've stopped. Another week without water and your herd would have been gone. Silas would have had you by winter." Her hands shook with rage, but beneath it was something harder to face. Relief. He was right. She hated that he was right. Lydia turned her back on him, refusing to let him see the tear that slipped down her cheek. "Take your men and leave. I didn't ask for your charity." Boone's voice followed, low and steady. "This isn't charity, Lydia, it's survival. Yours and mine both." The words puzzled her, but she wouldn't let herself ask what he meant. She slammed the barn door behind her, shutting out his voice, shutting out the confusion that burned hotter than the drought itself. Later that night, alone at her table, she found another note slipped under her door. Boone's handwriting again. "Silas wants you broken. I won't let him take what's yours. Even if you hate me for it." Lydia read it twice, her hands trembling. She wanted to tear it up, to scatter it in the wind. Instead, she set it down carefully, as if the words themselves carried a weight she couldn't shake. The ranch creaked in the night wind, the cattle shifting restlessly, the land waiting for rain that would not come. Somewhere out there, Silas Hart was watching, circling like a wolf. Boone Calder was circling too, but his shadow felt different, dangerous in another way. Lydia Cross closed her eyes, whispering to herself, "I won't break. Not for Silas, not for Boone, not for anyone." But as sleep crept in, doubt lingered, and doubt was a crack no drought could make. It was born inside, growing deeper with each day. The morning came gray, with clouds that promised rain but gave nothing. Lydia walked the ridge above her ranch, scanning the horizon. From up there she could see everything, her cattle scattered thin, the barn standing lonely, the creek bed almost dry. It looked smaller than it once had, weaker, as if the land itself was weary. She heard hoofbeats behind her. Turning, she saw Boone Calder riding up the slope, his horse steady, his posture straight. She wanted to walk away, but the ridge was narrow and Boone rode too close. He dismounted, tied his reins to a scrubby bush, and stood beside her. For a long while he said nothing. He just stared out at the land. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "I once stood on a ridge just like this, watching my ranch die. Same drought, same silence." Lydia's eyes narrowed. You've never lost anything." Boone's jaw tightened. "You're wrong. Silas Hart took it from me, burned me out, bought the land for pennies after he starved me down. I swore it wouldn't happen again." The word struck Lydia like a sudden wind. She turned fully toward him, searching his face for lies. But there was no jest in his eyes, only something she hadn't seen before. Raw memory, pain buried deep. "So that's why you're circling me," she said slowly. "Not just for me. Not just for this ranch. It's him," Boone nodded once. "If Hart takes your land, he grows stronger. And if he breaks you, he wins again. I can't let that happen." The truth twisted inside her, sharp and confusing. She had painted Boone as a vulture circling her weakness. But now she saw something else. A man fighting his own ghosts, using her battle as his chance for revenge. Her voice was unsteady. "And the bargain you offered? My ranch, my body, my Sundays, was that about revenge too?" Boone's gaze didn't flinch. "No, that was about wanting you. I won't dress it up. But it was also about survival, yours and mine. Together we could stand against Hart." Lydia turned away, her breath heavy. The ridge stretched before her, wide and empty, as if it carried the weight of her choices. "Why should I trust you?" she asked at last. Boone stepped closer, his shadow falling beside hers. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything. And I'd see Hart in the ground before I let him do it to you." The silence between them grew thick. Lydia's pride fought with her fear, her anger with her need. She wanted to scream at him, to strike him, to believe him. But all she could do was stand there staring at the broken land, her heart pounding too fast. When Boone finally rode away, his figure small against the horizon, Lydia sank onto a rock, her hands trembling. The truth he had spoken gnawed at her. If Silas had burned him out once, he would burn her too. And Boone, for all his arrogance, might be the only shield she had. That night she dreamed of fire, flames racing across her pasture, smoke filling the sky, voices shouting in the dark. She woke gasping, sweat on her skin, her heart thudding like hooves in the distance. Outside, the ranch lay quiet, but the dream felt too close, too real. Somewhere she knew Silas was planning his next strike, and Boone Calder had just handed her a reason to let him in. The days after Boone's confession were restless ones. Lydia could not shake his words. Each time she walked the fields, each time she drew water from the well, she heard his voice. "Silas burned me out. I won't let him do it again." She wanted to stay hard, untouched, unbent, but she found herself watching the horizon more often, wondering if Boone's riders were near, wondering if he would come again. She hated that part of her heart that waited for him. In town, the whispers sharpened. At the church steps, a woman stopped her with a cold stare. "Your Sundays belong to Boone now, don't they?" The words were loud enough for half the congregation to hear. Lydia held her head high. "My Sundays belong to no man." She walked away, but the sting of their laughter followed her down the street. Later that week, she found another warning on her land. A calf lay dead near the creek, not from drought, but from poison. The sight made her stomach twist, rage boiling hot. She buried the small body herself, sweat mixing with tears she would not admit to. That night she rode into town under moonlight and confronted Silas Hart outside the saloon. He was a broad man with a thick beard, his voice smooth as oil when he greeted her. "Mrs. Cross," he said, tipping his hat mockingly. "You're up late. Trouble sleeping without a man to keep your door safe?" Lydia's hand tightened on the reins. "Stay off my land, Silas, you and your men. Next time I catch you near my fences, I'll bring the sheriff." Silas chuckled low. "The sheriff likes proof. And I leave none. But everyone knows you're finished, Lydia. The drought will take you or Boone will. Either way, that ranch ends up in a man's hands. Might as well be mine." Her nails dug into her palms. "Over my dead body." Silas leaned close, his smile sharp. "That can be arranged." The words chilled her. She turned her horse and rode hard, refusing to look back. But fear coiled in her chest like a snake. The next day, Boone arrived without warning. He found her repairing a broken trough and slid from his horse, silent until she noticed him. "You confronted Hart," he said, reading the truth in her face. "That was foolish." "I don't need your scolding," Lydia snapped. Boone stepped closer, his voice low, urgent. "Hart won't play fair. He never has. You're already a target. If you face him alone, you won't survive it. Her hands trembled, but she forced them steady. I've stood alone this long. Boone's eyes burned into hers. And it's killing you. Let me stand with you. Not as your keeper, but as your partner. The word partner struck her differently than his earlier bargain. It was softer, less cruel. Still dangerous, but not the same trap. Lydia turned away, staring at the dry field stretching into the horizon. Pride screamed at her to reject him. Fear whispered to let him in. Between them, she felt pulled apart, every breath a battle. That night, she couldn't sleep. She walked the ridge under the stars, rifle in hand. The land was silent, but her heart was loud. She thought of Boone's offer, of Silas's threat, of the preacher's warning. Every path seemed to end in ruin. Then she saw it. A thin line of smoke in the distance, curling up against the night sky. Her chest tightened. Trouble had begun. The thin line of smoke grew thicker as Lydia hurried down the ridge, her rifle clutched tight. The smell of fire drifted sharp and bitter on the wind. By the time she reached her barn, orange light flickered against the wood. Flames licked at the lower boards, snapping and hissing. Her heart thundered. The barn was more than wood and nails. It held her tools, her feed, the heart of her work. If it burned, the ranch would bleed out before winter. She dropped the rifle, grabbed buckets, and ran to the well. Water sloshed over her hands as she hauled and threw, her breath tearing from her chest. But the flames climbed higher, faster than her buckets could fight. Sparks leaped into the night air, threatening the roof. Then, hooves. Boone Calder burst from the darkness with 3 riders at his back. They swung from their saddles without a word, forming a line beside her. Buckets flew from hand to hand, water-soaking boots and sleeves, steam rising in thick clouds. "Keep low," Boone shouted, pulling a burning plank free before it could fall. His face was black with smoke, his shirt damp, but his movements were steady, sure. Lydia worked beside him, her arms trembling, her lungs raw. At one point, a falling ember caught her sleeve. Boone was there in a flash, smothering the flame with his bare hand. He didn't flinch. He just kept working. After what felt like hours, the fire gave way. Smoke drifted in weak trails, the barn still standing, though scarred and blackened. The 4 of them stood in the dirt, soaked, coughing, staring at the wreck they had saved. Lydia bent double, her hands on her knees, gasping. Boone touched her shoulder gently, his voice hoarse. "You would have lost it without help." She wanted to argue, to tell him she could have managed alone. But her strength was gone, her pride cracked wide open. All she could whisper was, "They meant to ruin me." Boone's eyes hardened. Heart's men. No doubt. As if to prove him right, one of Boone's riders pulled a charred scrap of cloth from the dirt, an old kerchief with Hart's brand stitched in the corner. Boone held it up to the lantern light, his jaw tight. "Proof," he said. This time he left a trail. Lydia's chest heaved as anger rose sharply inside her. Hart hadn't just threatened. He'd struck, bold and shameless. The sheriff could not ignore this. But the thought of going into town filled her with dread. Already, the whispers cut her every time she walked down Main Street. Now they would say Boone fought her fire because she had already surrendered herself to him. Still, the barn stood because of him. The ranch breathed because of him. Pride no longer felt enough to lean on. Later, when the riders left, Boone lingered. He stood close, his face lit by the dying lantern. Hart will come again, harder. He won't stop until he has this land. But now we have proof, and we have each other. Lydia met his eyes, searching them in the smoke and shadows. For the first time, she didn't see a vulture circling. She saw a man fighting beside her, scarred by the same enemy. Her throat ached as she said softly, "This isn't over." Boone nodded. "No, but when it ends, it'll end with us standing, or him buried." The night held quiet after that, broken only by the soft crack of cooling wood. The barn still stood, though war was coming. The next morning, Lydia rode into town with Boone at her side. The burned scrap of cloth, Hart's brand stitched clear, lay folded in her saddlebag. The town was already buzzing with news of the fire. By the time she tied her horse outside the sheriff's office, a small crowd had gathered, whispering and pointing. Sheriff Wallace met them at the door. His eyes narrowed when Boone placed the cloth on his desk. "Hart's men," Boone said. "Caught red-handed this time." The sheriff studied the evidence, his jaw set. "This is enough to bring charges, but you both know Hart won't come quietly." Lydia's voice was steady, though her hands trembled. "Then he'll show his true face to the town." Word spread fast. By noon, Hart himself stormed into town with half a dozen riders. He walked into the saloon, loud and certain, declaring Boone had planted the cloth to smear him. "That widow's ranch is falling apart," he shouted. And Boone called her once it for himself. "He's using her as his excuse," the crowd murmured, divided. Some nodded at Hart's words. Others frowned with doubt. For the first time, the town wasn't united in its whispers. Lines were being drawn. That evening, Reverend Merrick gathered folks at the church, urging peace. "No blood needs to be shed," he warned. But the people had already chosen sides. Some believed Hart. Others stood behind Boone and Lydia. The air was heavy with suspicion, anger, and something darker. Fear. Back at the ranch, Boone sharpened his rifle and checked the gates. Lydia worked beside him, her hands blistered but steady. She felt the weight of the coming storm pressing down. Every sound in the distance made her nerves tighten. As they worked, Boone spoke quietly. "When Hart comes, he'll come hard. He'll try to break you, make an example of you, but he won't expect you to fight back." Lydia glanced at him, her chest tight. "You sound certain." Boone gave a grim smile. "I know the man. He did the same to me. He believes fear makes folks bow, but this time he's wrong." Night fell heavily. The ranch lay quiet, too quiet. Lydia sat by the window with her rifle across her lap. She thought of her late husband, of the promise she had made at his grave to keep this land alive. Now, with Boone at her side, she wondered if that promise was about more than land. It was about standing against the kind of man who thought power gave him ownership of others. Near midnight, Boone stepped in from outside, his voice low. "They're out there. I can feel it," and he was right. In the distance, faint at first, came the sound of hooves. Dozens of them. The ground trembled with their weight. Lydia's blood ran cold, but she gripped her rifle tighter, her breath steady. Boone stood at the door, rifle in hand, eyes sharp. "This is it," he said. "Hart's coming to end it." The cattle stirred nervously in the dark. The barn creaked. The night seemed to hold its breath. Lydia rose to her feet, pride burning bright through her fear. "Then let him try. This land won't bow, and neither will I." The sound of hooves grew louder, closer, until the ranch shook under their approach. Torches flickered against the horizon, orange flames bobbing like a line of fire snakes in the dark. Hart had come. Torches lit the night as Hart and his riders closed in. Flames licked against the darkness, their shouts carried on the wind. Boone and Lydia stood at the gate, rifles ready, shadows cast long by the firelight. Hart rode in front, tall in the saddle, his voice carrying like thunder. "This is the end, Widow Cross. Step aside and maybe I'll leave you with your life." Lydia's heart pounded, but her voice rang clear. "This land is mine. You'll never take it." The riders fanned out, circling the ranch. Boone raised his rifle, steady as stone. "Back off, Hart. Sheriff has the proof. Your forged claims, your men at the barn, you're finished." Hart laughed, sharp and cruel. "Sheriff's just a man. The town bends to fear, not to papers." He spurred his horse forward. "Tonight the ranch burns, and so do you." But the sound of more hooves thundered from behind. Out of the dark rode Sheriff Wallace with a line of townsfolk, men and women carrying lanterns, rifles, and pitchforks. The sheriff's voice cut through the night. "This ends here, Hart. We've seen enough." Hart snarled, realizing too late his hold on the town had cracked. "You think they'll stand against me?" The townsfolk shouted back, voices loud, firm, and united. "We will." Tension broke like lightning. Hart raised his gun, firing toward Boone. Boone dropped to one knee, returning fire. The shot clipped Hart's arm, spinning him in the saddle. His horse reared, nearly throwing him. Hart's men charged, but the townsfolk didn't scatter. They fired back, pushing the riders off balance. Boone fought hard, every shot precise. Lydia took aim from the gate, her hand steady, her heart fierce. She fired once, shattering the torch in Hart's hand. Flames fell harmlessly into the dirt. Chaos turned fast. Hart's men, seeing the town against them, lost their nerve. One after another they turned tail, galloping off into the night. Only Hart remained, clutching his bleeding arm, rage twisting his face. The sheriff rode forward, pistol raised. "It's over, Hart, drop it." For a long moment Hart hesitated, hatred burning in his eyes. Then his pistol clattered to the ground. He slumped in the saddle, broken not by bullets, but by the sight of the town he once ruled, turning its back on him. The sheriff's deputies dragged him down, binding his hands. The crowd let out a cheer, rough and tired but full of relief. Lydia lowered her rifle, her body shaking. Boone stepped to her side, steadying her. For the first time she leaned into him, not from weakness but from choice. "You stood your ground," Boone said softly. "No one can take that from you." She looked at him, eyes shining with firelight and tears. "Neither can they take it from us." The dawn came slowly, painting the land gold. Smoke still hung in the air, but the ranch stood unbroken. Townsfolk lingered, helping mend fences and patting Boone's back. Some even tipped their hats to Lydia, no longer with pity or scorn, but with respect. By week's end, Sheriff Wallace had Hart locked in irons, his claims stripped away. The town was quiet again, though changed. Folks remembered who had stood tall when fear tried to take hold. On Sunday morning, Lydia rode out beside Boone. The land stretched wide and free, the air calm after the storm. For the first time in months, her chest felt light. Boone glanced at her with a small grin. "So, Sundays. Do I still get them?" Lydia smiled, her voice low but sure. "You get more than Sundays. You get me, but as a partner, not a prize." Boone tipped his hat, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen. "That's all I ever wanted." Side by side they rode across the ranch, the land alive under them. What began as a bargain born of fear had become something truer, a bond forged in fire, in trust and in choice. And so the widow and the cattleman claimed more than land. They claimed a future together. If you enjoyed this Wild West tale, don't forget to subscribe for more stories of grit, love, and survival on the frontier. Your support keeps these frontier voices alive, so saddle up and join us for the next ride.